think I know everybody here, but maybe for the sake of the recording, I'm Luciana Spraker with the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives, and I'm really happy to have all of you here today. I did want to acknowledge that today is the anniversary of 9/11, and I thought it might be nice if we did a brief moment of silence in memory of those who lost their lives today. So by coincidence, we have this program today, but I think maybe perhaps it's fitting because the program today is going to focus on the nuclear ship Savannah, which was part of President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, which helped demonstrate the peaceful use of nuclear energy around the world. Our speaker is Erhard Kohler. He's manager of the NS Savannah programs for the Maritime Administration, or MARAD for short. Erhard is a graduate of SUNY Maritime College with a degree in naval architecture. And after working as a structural and field support engineer in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, he joined MARAD's Office of Ship Operations. He soon was assigned to oversee the nuclear ship Savannah's return to MARAD custody. And then since 1992, he's overseen the work with the NS Savannah, and as manager is responsible for all program activities related to licensed operations, maintenance, repair, custody, and preservation of the ship. He leads the organization in performing the decommissioning of the ship's remaining nuclear facilities, and it's really very, very interesting, such a unique story to learn about too. So we're really fortunate that we were able to snag Erhard while he was in town to meet with other people about the nuclear ship Savannah, and he is in town from Baltimore. But I think he likes Savannah. Is going to keep coming back, right? I
do. I'm getting plenty of steps in. I'll tell you that much.
So I'm going to turn it over to Erhard. And just if you didn't get a chance to see the pop-up exhibit after the talk, please do check out some of the artifacts from the city's municipal archives collections related to the ship.
Thank you, Luciana. And please take all the brochures and the welcome aboard books, because I don't want to have to carry them back on the plane. But thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about your ship. Okay, let's make it clear: the nuclear ship Savannah is, as much as anyone else's, the city of Savannah's and the state of Georgia's ship. The city made great efforts in 1961 and 62 to ensure that this ship would bear the home port, Savannah, Georgia. And even though it was launched with Washington, D.C. welded to the stern, as Maritime Administration ships usually did, by the time the ship came here in 62, Savannah, Georgia graced the stern. And so as our agency is working towards the completion of the decommissioning project and is seeking a preservation outcome, as I'll describe today, for the disposition of the ship, understand that it is Savannah's ship, and we're very proud to be here talking to you today about your ship. So what is it? This is the nuclear ship Savannah, depicted 15 years ago today, on the morning of September 11th, 2019, in the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, as it was being towed from Baltimore up to a shipyard in Philadelphia. It happened to be the site of my former Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where she went into dry dock for a 2-month availability that turned into 6, typical. I shot that very early in the morning, not long after sunrise, as she was coming up through the canal. Under tow, but as you can see, with the flag flying and looking pretty good, as the ship has for many years now. I would also like to make a shout out that today is my mother's 85th birthday. It was her 80th birthday that morning, and I wasn't able to get to the shipyard. I had to divert up to her house for the family celebration. So happy birthday, Mom, but it is, among other things, of course, the world's first nuclear powered merchant ship, a national historic landmark, which is really important and bears in the story, and then has other designations from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the American Nuclear Society, and we're very proud of the Ship of the Year award from 2012 from the Steamship Historical Society of America. 70 years ago, next April 25th, President Eisenhower publicly announced the addition of a nuclear merchant ship to the nation's Atoms for Peace program. It was something of a surprise. You know, we really like to believe that the year before, in April of '54, after Mamie Eisenhower christened the USS Nautilus up in Groton, Connecticut, she took the train back down to D.C., came home to the White House that evening. Ike asked her how her day was, and he had the inspiration to add a nuclear-powered merchant ship to the Atoms for Peace program. It's probably not that far from the truth. What we do know from research is that the National Security Council was assigned the task to look into this project, and they debated that for the better part of a year. So it was not until the following spring in '55 that the decision was made by Eisenhower to endorse this project and then to publicly announce it shortly before he submitted legislation to the Congress to request it. At the time, as Congress was debating the project throughout 1955 and into '56, they considered naming the ship the Atomic Enterprise. We're very happy that industry and forefathers from here in Savannah promoted the name Savannah instead. But I will tell you the little anecdote that prior to selection of the name Savannah, the ship was referred to as the Atomic Ship. Atomic ship enterprise, or atomic ship this, or atomic ship that. And those of you who work in government know that we all are fond of three-letter acronyms. And so after the name Savannah was selected, it became the nuclear ship Savannah. And you can imagine why. Of course, named for the SS Savannah of 1819. And you know, we're extremely proud of our association with that pioneering vessel. So much so that in 2019, on National Maritime Day, when we were celebrating National Maritime Day, and it happened to fall that Sunday on the 19th, on the 18th, we had a symposium that was together with the Steamship Historical Society of America that was styled as 200 years of oceanic steam navigation in honor of our pioneering namesake. And we talked about the development of steam propulsion in the United States and elsewhere, culminating with Savannah's voyage to Liverpool. So proposed by Eisenhower in '55 and authorized by the Congress in 1956, Eisenhower wanted to build essentially what was some derided as a showboat, an example of the use of the technology in civilian application without military involvement, but with little else to do than that. Congress was not willing to spend money for that, but they did see, and there had been quite a few studies and proposals predating the Savannah program on the application of nuclear technology to commercial shipping. And so Congress wanted to authorize a prototype vessel that could explore all of the issues that would be associated with taking that nascent technology to sea in a commercial environment. And that's what they essentially authorized. The ship had two purposes, and despite what the internet will tell you, it did both jobs really well. All right, it did both jobs really well, beginning with Savannah's maiden voyage and a call to Savannah, Georgia on August 22nd, 1962. Now, those of you who are familiar with photographs of the day will recognize that on the 22nd of August, Savannah was steaming up the river, not down the river. And so this is actually on her departure a few days later, but it is, of course, that maiden port call in August of '62. I figured I would get that out of there before somebody was going to say, wait a minute, City Hall is here, and, you know, so. 35,000 people touring the ship over the 6-day period. That was not the record, by the way. The ship later established much higher records for import visitation, to the extent that in some cases, tens of thousands visited per day. But it was a great fanfare. The ship adopted by her home port city and visited by so many folks, and then the great welcoming ceremonies that were held at the State Pier as the ship was arriving, and you know, with a member of the Atomic Energy Commission, the Secretary of Commerce. At the time, the Maritime Administration was part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. After 1981, it's been part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, which is where I work. But Commerce was heavily involved in the project. She came back one more time while in service in 1967. This was as a port call as a cargo ship. Savannah was not on the regular rotation for the ship's operating company, American Exporters Branson Lines, which typically ran the U.S. East Coast, Hoboken, Philadelphia, through the C&D Canal to Baltimore and Norfolk, and then over to Europe, to the Mediterranean, or to the Far East via the Panama Canal. So to call in Savannah was unusual, but the call was made in 1967. And then of course, the ship was removed from service in the middle of 1970. Again, myths and legends abound on the internet. Why was it removed from service in 1970? Well, first off, because it had satisfied all of the programmatic objectives that had been set for it. There was really nothing else to prove. The program was wholly successful. One of the things that the program was not designed to do was ensure that there would be second-generation ships built either in the United States or elsewhere. And the construction of ships at, not only in 1970, but throughout the latter half of the 20th century in the United States involved government support in the form of subsidies and other things that were complex, but were typically founded on the principle of offsetting the differential cost between foreign-built ships, foreign-operated ships, and their U.S. counterparts. When there are no foreign nuclear merchant ships, there is no differential to calculate, there is no way to come up with a subsidy, and nuclear-powered ships are much more expensive to build. At the time, they weren't necessarily more expensive to operate, though they were heavily staffed, at a time when ships were more heavily staffed than they are today. And there was no understanding at the time of this concept of decommissioning. What do you do with a nuclear power plant at the end of its life? As the citizens in this area will find out when Vogtle 1 and 2 shut down at some date in the future, and that hopefully the trust fund will have enough money for the decommissioning there. So Savannah came out of service because it was successful, it had proven everything it could do, and the federal government had other programs that really needed the money more. Things like the Apollo program, which were still sucking up significant amounts of discretionary funding, the implementation of the Great Society programs that had been passed in the mid-60s, and finally the Vietnam War, which, unlike many of our wars of late, was on the federal budget. Okay, it was not. There were no emergency authorizations and things like that. It was paid for on the Defense Department budget, and so money was needed for other things. And the Savannah program was a casualty of that budget process, beginning in fiscal 1971. So it did shut down prematurely. There's also the myth and the legend that the ship did not go to Japan because the Japanese wouldn't let it in. That was not true. The Japanese actually approved 4 ports for the Savannah to call had it operated into 1971. The Japanese Diet was in the process of amending their own constitution to permit their nuclear ship program and their nuclear generating program, the landside nuclear power plants such as Fukushima, which we all know. And before the Savannah could not come to Japan before the Constitution was changed to permit nuclear power in Japan, and hence the need to wait to 1971. But 4 ports were approved, and had the ship operated, it would have gone to Japan. Alternatively, it might have made voyages to South America. So what do you do with a nuclear power plant disguised by a ship that now has outlived its usefulness? Well, the Nixon administration was approached by the city of Savannah with the idea of bringing the ship here to establish what they styled as the Eisenhower Peace Memorial. And President Nixon, of course, who had been Ike's vice president, the families were brought together by marriage. Pat Nixon had officiated at the keel-laying ceremony for the NS Savannah on Maritime Day in 1958. Of course Nixon was in favor of doing this, and so the administration sent out, some of the staff and said, make this happen. And so the NS Savannah was towed here after the reactor was defueled at the end of 1971 at its servicing facility in Galveston, Texas. So she came here in 1972 at a time when nobody had a clue from a regulatory perspective, a licensing perspective, what do you do with a nuclear power plant that is shut down? Because all the plants we had built in the United States, even for the Manhattan Project, were still operating or just on the cusp of coming out of service. And so there were no regulations, there was no guidance, there was no framework. The only framework that MARAD had for what to do with this plant was what was done to it by the Atomic Energy Commission in 1965, when the joint program that had been established to construct and operate the ship was dissolved upon the issuance of the operating license. The Atomic Energy Commission was one of these agencies that both promoted an industry and regulated it. And so when the license was issued for regulation, they ended the promotional part. And they did so by vesting all title and future financial liability on the Department of Commerce. And so the Department of Commerce naturally thought, well, that's what we have to do with Georgia. If they want the ship, we're going to give it to them lock, stock, and barrel. And after a few years of hand-wringing, Governor Carter decided that was not a good deal for the state, and please remove it. And that, as much as anything else, was why the Eisenhower Peace Memorial effort in Savannah in the early 1970s failed. And it was a function of the presence of the NRC license. And we will see later why that is not going to be an impediment in the future. Despite the fact that the ship left in '75, it is surrounding us everywhere. Luciana has brought some of the exhibit materials from 2012. There are other exhibits throughout the city, and of course there are the markers, not the least of which is the Propeller Club fountain down on the waterfront, and the 50th anniversary maiden voyage commemorative marker at the convention center, which I was pleased to work with GHS and Luciana when that was installed in August of 2012, and was until this year my last visit to the city. And throughout, of course, you have at the archives, Ships of the Sea, GHS, Coastal Heritage, and others. So the Savannah, NS Savannah, is here in the city. I've mentioned before that we're seeking a preservation outcome for this ship, okay? Decommissioning and terminating the license will formally end the programmatic relationship that the Maritime Administration has with this vessel, the relationship that we have had since it was authorized in the summer of 1956, and the project was assigned to MARAD and the Atomic Energy Commission by President Eisenhower. Decommissioning the nuclear power plant did not mean destroying the ship, and in fact, it meant really that we improved it dramatically, so much so that it is essentially a turnkey museum ship today. And we have an obligation to see that it's preserved, going back to that designation as a federally owned National Historic Landmark, which I think we'll talk about in a slide or two coming up. So decommissioning is the process of when a nuclear power plant shuts down and permanently ceases operations, you begin an up to 60-year timeline under NRC regulations for the fuel to be removed from the reactor, for the fuel to be cooled, placed into storage. The power plant is brought to a condition of protective storage initially, and then ultimately you can either do it immediately or you can wait a period of decades if you wish, before you do the controlled industrial dismantlement that removes the plant components and systems, the structures, sends the waste to licensed waste repositories. Ours is going out to Utah or has gone to Utah, and then restores the site to a predetermined release criteria specified by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. In our case, we are using the release criteria from the Environmental Protection Agency, which is actually lower than the NRC's, and we're doing this because whether the ship is preserved or scrapped or reefed in the future, the EPA has a role in that after the NRC license is terminated and the NRC is gone. So we didn't want any regulatory jurisdictional conflict by using a higher number than EPA uses that would then force us to do additional remediation. Decommissioning, as I said, is about removing the components of the nuclear power plant and disposing of them. So this is Savannah's containment vessel. The nuclear power plant is within the containment vessel and in some of the outlying spaces. Some of the auxiliary systems surrounded the containment vessel. They didn't have to be inside the containment. The plant generated saturated steam that was fed to the ship's machinery, to the propulsion turbines and the turbine generators for direct drive to the propeller or for generation of electricity for ship service. The engine room is untouched by any of this because Savannah is using a pressurized water reactor. There are two primary types of light water reactors, the PWR, the pressurized water reactor, and the boiling water reactor, which, as the name suggests, allows the water to boil. The water that cools the reactor boils. It produces what is arguably radioactive steam that then goes to the turbines, and your turbines may become contaminated. Well, we were fortunate it was a PWR and not a boiling water reactor because our turbines are not contaminated. And the garish colors from 1964 remain inside the plant. We did strip all the asbestos, but the plant is intact and repainted authentically. Inside containment, we removed the reactor vessel itself in the center. We removed the control rod drive tower that was above it. The red is the primary coolant that cooled the core, and then transferred the heat to the secondary system. So there are heat exchangers in the bottom of the two steam generator assemblies. And the water flowed through tubes, the primary coolant flowed through tubes, and the secondary water surrounded the tubes, picked up the heat, and boiled. All right, so we removed the tubes from the heat exchanger. But as you'll see in a later photo, we were able to save the steam generator assemblies on both sides of the ship, port and starboard. The pressurizer had a hole cut in the side, the internals gutted out, but the shell remains in place. And surrounding the reactor was an annular water tank, a 33-inch deep water tank, kind of like a donut, if you will, that surrounded the reactor because that was a form of shielding for a type of radiation, neutron radiation. And we were able to keep the outside wall. We excised the reactor and the inside wall from within the tank and left the outside wall. And the practical effect of that is the view shed from the doorway we built is essentially unchanged before decommissioning and after decommissioning. And now visitors can walk through, and there's a walking path through there with inclined ladders, let you go through it. How many of you have ever visited one of the battleships and be able to walk underneath the turrets? Okay, so pretty cool to walk through the magazines and the shell handling rooms. That's essentially the same thing you'll be able to do here. And this is a feature that exists nowhere else in the world, and it's a feature that was never available in Savannah's prior service as a museum at Patriots Point from 1981 to 1994. I repossessed it from there. So that is the scope. Now, decommissioning, which basically infers that everything goes away, is not compatible with the National Historic Preservation Act, which for federally owned landmarks seeks to minimize harm, not just in planning, but also in execution, right? So how do you conform this? Well, we conform it through consultation under the National Historic Preservation Act. And of course, you know, it was relatively straightforward to consult with the National Park Service, the State Historic Preservation Office in Maryland, and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was another story because they have prescriptive regulations for decommissioning, what happens to the plant when you're done. However, you heard me say Atomic Energy Commission and Nuclear Regulatory Commission. In 1974, the Atomic Energy Commission was disestablished and its functions were split, the promotional functions as well as the production of nuclear weapons and naval reactors became today's Department of Energy. The regulatory side for commercial applications of nuclear technology became the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that includes federal licensees like the Department of Commerce and then Transportation. The NRC is very possessive of its history going back to the formation of the Atomic Energy Commission, and among the agencies with interest in the NS Savannah is probably the most interested in its preservation. And so the NRC took a very active role through the consultation in working with MARAD to define and construct a preservation scenario for this unique facility, for this federally owned landmark. And so it really was a cooperative effort where historic preservation and consultation is sometimes antagonistic. We never had that problem, and I'm grateful not only to the NRC but also to the succession of leadership at the Maritime Administration who appreciated what we were trying to do and allowed us to construct that program. I created these decommissioning principles early in the project as a way of guiding how we would use the ship in decommissioning. There are no nuclear-capable commercial shipyards in the United States. There never were, but for Todd Shipyards when it was working on Savannah. All naval ships in the world today are either Russian icebreakers or they are military vessels, and nuclear ship maintenance and repair and nuclear ship construction in the United States is controlled by the Navy, even when it occurs at the private shipyards at Newport News and Electric Boat in Connecticut. So for us, our decommissioning project was to make use of the commercial, mature decommissioning industry that exists in the United States. Ours turned out, because of decades of protective storage, to not be the first commercial plant to be decommissioned. There is an industry that exists to do that. And so we were making use of them, and just as they mobilized to the different landside sites, they mobilized to us. The difference between us and land sites is that land sites have land, and they have laydown area for cranes and for buildings that they can put up temporarily to process and handle waste and package it. Our licensed site didn't have land. It was the ship's hull itself. And so we needed to keep our project within that boundary, because when you go off-site, when you go outside the boundary, suddenly you have state jurisdiction, you have other federal jurisdiction, you're outside the embrace of the NRC, which solely regulates inside the site. And so we made the decision that we would use the ship's volume for that purpose, which is how we wound up applying these principles to guide how we adapted the ship, both the interior, the normally occupied areas, staterooms and public spaces, but also the cargo holds, which have been dramatically transformed and climate controlled. The opportunity to improve the ship was exercised freely, openly, and extensively, and results, as we'll see, in a ship that's really ready to serve in any capacity in the future, any static capacity. So again, we used the ship, but we also intended everything that we did to the ship to be available for adaptive reuse. Somebody asked me this morning, I was at the convention center board meeting, and they said, what about the cargo holds? And I talked about the cargo holds being insulated and climate controlled, and we built fire stair towers inside to provide access from bottom to top and outside. I neglected to mention the fact that we have a training center in cargo hold 3 that, because of the shear of the deck and the trim of the ship so that it's an inclined deck, looks remarkably like, you could take this room, make the floor go upwards towards the back, and that would be our training area, and that's what we have in cargo hold 3 with the bathrooms next to that. So there's a built-in theater, adaptive reuse to a theater. Somebody who criticized me years ago called it an IMAX theater in cargo hold 3. He wasn't quite right, although my original plan was something along those lines and I had to modify it. But in any event, we used the ship and we intended it for adaptive reuse, so everything we built was sympathetic to the architectural features that existed elsewhere in the ship. There's nothing, you would not necessarily know that what we've done is not original, because we wanted to make sure that it was sympathetic to the details, to the finish, to the colors. And we preserved surrounding architectural features so that it would all blend in. And as I mentioned, we took this unusual approach. You know, it's oftentimes easier and less expensive to simply take everything out and put it in the ground. But we didn't do that. We left things behind where we could, where it was reasonable to do so and where it had interpretive value. So the result of all of this is the ship is a museum in all but name, and it is in all but name because our agency has a museum. It's at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, and we're not authorized to operate a museum ship, but we do have a landmark to which we provide public access. And these are all contemporary photos. This is the ship as it appears today. And if you ever had the privilege of visiting it at Patriots Point, or perhaps the dismay of visiting it after Hurricane Hugo in 1989, you would think that the ship is in far better condition today than it was in 1994. And I can attest to that because she was in many respects a floating derelict when we took her out of there in 1994. And it didn't get any better during the 12 years it was in our reserve fleet. We have restored the public spaces outside of the scope of decommissioning. They have all been brought back to their original colors. The public spaces were originally air conditioned. The ship's air conditioning flowed through perforated acoustic asbestos ceilings, right? So the air is flowing through the holes in the asbestos ceiling tiles, which were removed and replaced with perforated aluminum in the same pattern. The only thing that we wound up doing, that Jack Heaney would come up, the interior designer would come out of his grave and would throttle me, is instead of using countersunk screws, we have panhead screws up there. So it's like rivet lines. You know, if you're a railroad buff and you want to do rivet counting, you can do rivet counting in the ceilings on Savannah that never existed before. So Jack would not be happy, but other than that, you know, we did a pretty good job. And you can see, you know, the veranda from the 60s. In 2023, the chairs that we have are not the original chairs, but they were adaptations from other ship chairs that we made to be representative, evocative of the chairs that were in the space. And they're very comfortable, more comfortable, I think, than the originals were. And then in the dining room, you know, as you can see, we use it. We use it frequently. That happened to be a Halloween party last year. And right there in the middle is the gilded model of the SS Savannah, our namesake. There's a beautiful Stobart print of it in the dining hall. And then there's another model up in the main lobby. So we honor SS Savannah every day there. And here is the view shed of the nuclear power plant today. here in the lower right is the exposed collision boundary that surrounds the reactor compartment. Now, this was when the Savannah was authorized in July of 1956. It was 1 week before the collision between the Swedish liner Stockholm and the Italian liner Andrea Doria, with the loss of the Doria 11 hours later and 50 people who died in the collision. No one died in the evacuation, but everybody who died in the collision. So it's a week after the nuclear merchant ship is authorized. And of course, safety was already of paramount concern, but this episode severely taxed existing ship design and questioned existing ship design and required that Savannah's designers take that into account. Savannah was designed to withstand that type of collision with up to 95% of the world fleet as it existed at the time. So battleships, aircraft carriers, super express liners like the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the United States would be capable of defeating this system. But the typical merchant ship and virtually every other ship afloat would not. And so it's a 17 feet of ship structure that's heavily reinforced, and then begins the reactor compartment with a 25-inch deep collision boundary of 1-inch steel, 3-inch redwood alternating in 6 layers, followed by concrete that surrounded the containment vessel. Never could you see it. You could see a drawing of it. You could never see it. Now you walk through. That's the entrance that we created into the CV, a 6x6 personnel access, because in the past, the only way you could get into containment was through an airlock in the top, and that was not going to be safe for the workers. So we cut this hole in the side. And in the process, exposed that boundary, polished it up, and put it behind plexiglass, and we show it off all the time. Because we've had visitors down into the containment vessel now since Maritime Day 2019, when we debuted it. And then, of course, there are all the improvements that we made to the ship to support the 85 to 90 people that were on board while we were working decommissioning, providing climate controls to the cargo hold so that those workers, and the reactor compartment, so that those workers did not suffer OSHA heat and cold stress that would otherwise impair their productivity. So we wanted them to work a 10-hour day because we work a compressed schedule. We did not want them to work, 3 hours of a 10-hour day because they're working for 20 minutes in the heat and then taking 40-minute breaks. And that has more than paid itself back. And that infrastructure remains behind when the project is done. Here is my training center / theater down in Cargo Hold 3 in the square of the hatch. So how does this end state compare to preservation? Any museum ship that exists in the United States today began life as a defunct ship with cold iron ship systems that you don't use in preservation, because if you want to operate the ship's air conditioning plant, you need to fire off the plant down in the engine room. You have to staff it. The Coast Guard will require you to staff it with engineers. You have to stand watch. It's not designed to be on off. It's going to, it's an extensive system, much more expensive than you need to operate. Every ship winds up being converted essentially into a building operating on electricity and with standalone systems. Exactly the same thing we had to do to establish the ship as a work site. And so again, just as we did with the modifications to the infrastructure, we designed this with the idea that it would be used in the future, that it would have it would be readily useful to a preservation outcome. We did the same when it came to considering access and egress. If you have to evacuate the ship, you need the means of getting people off. If you have a fire, you want to be able to get them off from outside, from up on the weather decks. So we have exterior weather access, both fore and aft. We have multiple means of access and egress, and we did NFPA life-saving analyses to determine what the occupancy could be and which is predicted basically by how quickly you can get the people off, or how many people can you get off in 30 minutes, which is usually the standard. All right. All of this combined with the original passenger features, which distinguish Savannah from most cargo ships or military combatant vessels that are the museum ship population that we have today, or the gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous 19th century iron-hulled square riggers that are around the country today. Savannah is distinguished from all of that because of the features that were built into it originally to support the Atoms for Peace mission. This ship would host 750, 800 people in in-port receptions. It would take people out for day trips. It would host those 10 and 20 and 30,000 people a day for walk-through tours of the ship. And I encourage you to take our Welcome Aboard book with the self-guided tour that exists today, because that's essentially the same tour route that the visitors took back in the 60s. So all of that exists, and it makes Savannah ready to be a museum ship, right? So we tried this before here in Savannah. Why didn't it work then? It's principally the NRC license. The capital improvements hadn't been made, and that was going to have to be funded, and some money would have had to be raised to do that. And of course, decommissioning hadn't been considered. So these were the things that were factors that prevented the ship from becoming the Eisenhower Peace Memorial in 1972 to 75. They go away, right? The NRC license is terminated. Any of the encumbrances associated with the license go away. There's no upfront capital to transform the ship into the building and for static use, because it's done and designed for adaptive reuse. And we, the agency, have existing authority to convey the ship. We do not need to ask Congress for permission to do this. We do not need to ask the Secretary of Transportation for permission to do this. We don't need to get clearance to go to any one particular port. We have authority to charter, which is a maritime lease. We have authority to donate. And at the end of it all, we have this affirmative obligation stemming from our role as the federal owner of a national historic landmark to see that it is not destroyed if there is any reasonable alternative to destruction. And so we are removing as many of the upfront burdens as exist that would make it difficult to convey the ship. We want the ship to be preserved. It's just not going to be on our budget. It's not going to be us doing it. It's going to have to be somebody else. But we want to make it as little pain as possible to allow that to occur. That is my story. It's such a deal. It's a once-in-a-generational opportunity. It's a form of opportunity that has never existed in the museum ship community before. It certainly is not what Savannah was, the city of Savannah was presented in 1972, but it is an option in 2026 for something a bit different. And this photograph is just a few months old. You can see here some of those improvements we made, the forward emergency egress from the weather, the aft emergency egress from the weather, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ways in and out of the ship, all right, all of which conveys with the ship along with the fenders, the mooring lines. You can see the propeller is up here very attractively displayed, which means it's not underwater, creating dissimilar metal corrosion of the hull. The ship was dry docked in 2020, all new paint. It's got brand new cathodic protection systems that are completely new, including the controls. We replaced the 1967 controls and their drooping vacuum tubes in 2020. Air conditioning, here, this is the doghouse, the 2 dog houses for the stairs inside the cargo holds that exit on the weather. That paint job is essentially from 2008. That's the bones of it, because having been the coatings coordinator for the agency for 10 years, I knew enough in 2008 to spring for the good paint and not the cheap paint that we normally use that fails after 5 to 10 years. And here again, you can see the flag proudly flying. This is our National Maritime Day weekend in 2024. The ship's bell is here on the prom deck, and we host our ceremonies on board. It's quite the attractive proposition. So I will leave you for questions, and I will point out, note that name on the stern. It says Savannah, Georgia. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Where was
Yes.
that last photograph taken?
In Baltimore, at our berth in Baltimore. The ship has been in Baltimore since 2008. the ship has a strong association with Baltimore as well, not just because it's been there longer than in any other single location, but it was one of the ports in the rotation when the ship was in service. It was dry docked there in 1975 and again in 1994. The prospects for the ship staying in Baltimore are not that good. So, and the pier that we happen to be at is not particularly great. It's a former grain elevator, and it's a wonderful place if you want to interpret the port. It's a horrible place to be a museum. So, but that again, that's just a couple months ago.
Can we see the
Yes.
solar power on that last picture where it comes in?
Sure. So, we have completely bypassed the ship's original switchboard. The only 2 lighting distribution nodes are functional in there. Everything has been air gapped. We removed the breakers, restored the front. We have a new load center that was installed in 2009. I'm giving you the technical details because it's a technical question. And so we have also replaced all of the vintage in-service transformers, so that dropped the load considerably when we did that. Shore power, all the shore connections are just right here at the sea deck level. They come into stateroom C12, just forward of the engineering side port. So we have 2 400 amp shore power service cables. We have some additional clean power that goes to our alarm systems. I go through that. We take water on through the side port. We converted the ship's distill tank for freshwater storage, and that distributes aft to the restroom facility. We're also putting in UV filtration and charcoal filters in order to provide a potable water service up to the veranda, to the bar and the pantries below it. We also take water forward for 4 storage tanks in cargo hold 3 that service the forward bathroom facility, and that's the principal service connections. We do have 2 on the pier sanitary holding tanks that we pump down to from the restroom facilities. There is not a sewage connection on the pier, so we don't have a fixed connection to that. Did I touch all of them?
Yeah, that was great.
Okay. Yeah.
Could you maybe give them a little update about some of the groups you've been talking to here this year?
Sure. So under the provisions of our consultation, we signed a programmatic agreement in March of last year. And among the stipulations was that MARAD would seek a preservation outcome and that MARAD would conduct outreach. And so we began that this time last year. We put out a Federal Register notice that said that the vessel was available for donation and that anybody could apply at any time for that. And we were seeking information for folks that would be interested in acquiring the ship, the different ports that might be interested and so forth. We followed that up during the comment period by reaching out to tourism bureaus and chambers of commerce in the different ports that the Savannah called and in some of the port cities that were adjacent. Among those was, of course, Savannah. And the Savannah Chamber of Commerce reached back to us and expressed interest. They also formally replied to the Federal Register notice. And so that led to continuing dialogue. I was here in July to address the Downtown Rotary. I did a presentation at Ships of the Sea Museum. That led to my invitation for tomorrow's presentation to the Propeller Club of Savannah. And then yesterday I met with Georgia Ports. I met with John Kay, principal here in the city. And Luciana was kind enough to slot me in here for this lecture as well during this visit. And this morning I was at the board meeting for the convention center. And I'm happy to say that, and I should say, of course, we briefed the city manager a couple of weeks ago as well. And I'm happy to say that there's certainly an affirmation that this is something to look into, something to be pursued, and hopefully it'll be something that results tangibly in the conveyance of the ship in a few years to the city.
Does anybody else have questions?
Yeah.
So let's see, was it the lobby, the restored lobby, was that was called?
The main lobby, yes.
The main lobby. I think I detected something that was in there. Are those ashtrays?
Of course they are. Of course they are. It's the 1960s. It was, it was very Mad Men-esque. It was mid-century. It wasn't mid-century modern per se, but the interior decor was evocative of American themes at the time. The ship was a smoker, it was a feeder, it was a drinker, because that's what they did back then. We have some photos on display from the officers. They're all partying in one of the passenger staterooms sometime in the 60s after the ship. The ship stopped carrying passengers in 1965. That was one of the few things that was done that changed the mission, if you will. And that was an economy measure, because it was not for lack of interest. The ship was booked well towards the end of the 60s. People wanted to be on the Savannah. But it cost money for the steward's department to support the passengers. And in an economy measure, the ship stopped carrying passengers after the license was issued in 1965, because they could reduce the crew by about 30 people. And that would reduce the cost to Merit. Now, the ship earned revenue through carrying passengers and cargo. And it earned revenue throughout its life. It earned more revenue than it was projected to earn, even though it was a relatively inefficient ship. And it was inefficient by design, because a principal objective in the design of the ship, and as Luciana mentioned, I have a degree in naval architecture, all right, not in nuclear engineering, so that's ship design. And nobody ever spends money to make a ship look good, except this one, which was intentionally made to look good, and as a consequence had only half as much cargo gear as was necessary to work the ship efficiently. People often say that the streamlined design, the beautiful curves and everything, made the cargo holds less efficient, that made them smaller. It didn't make them smaller. Savannah is a silk purse from a sow's ear. It is a standard C4, that's a designation for a size of a general cargo ship. It's a standard C4 gussied up with a lot of flared steel and curved steel. The cargo holds are actually about the same size, if not larger, than its contemporaries. But they were very inefficient because they only had half as many cargo booms. And yet, the ship made money. It didn't turn a profit, but it earned revenue. And that revenue, a portion of it went to the operating company as their profit, because the operating company was what was called a general agent. We reimbursed them for their expenses. They had a management fee, and then they had a small amount of money from the revenue that was their company profit for operating the ship on behalf of the government. And the remainder went to the Treasury as a general receipt, just like taxes. Right, So it was not enough to offset the cost of the budget for the program, but it did offset the cost to the government for the program. But the Maritime Administration never saw that money come back directly, right? So every year we had to seek appropriations for the Savannah program, and in the end it was that need to seek appropriations that saw the ship removed from service. It had a lot of life left, but just wasn't to be. Did I answer your question? Yeah, the ashtrays, right? Yeah, okay. How did I get from ashtrays to that? So, yeah.
Question. Since it was nuclear powered, you weren't worried about running out of diesel crossing the ocean. Did it cruise at faster than a normal ship at the time?
No, it was designed for the normal economical speed. What it didn't have was a reserve of power that most U.S. merchant ships possessed under subsidy to allow them to act as wartime auxiliaries. And so Savannah's service speed was 21 knots and its full speed was 22, as opposed to maybe 24 or 25 that some of its contemporary cargo ships would have had, because they had a reserve of power for use during wartime. Now, the other interesting facet of that is, why would people want to use nuclear propulsion on a commercial ship, right? You hit on one of them, which is you don't have fuel to burn up. A commercial cargo ship of that era is going to be carrying the fuel in the double bottom tanks. So you've got the outer skin of the ship, and then you have an inner bottom, and between that, in the tank top, in the 5 foot of the tank top, is where you carry your fuel oil and also carry ballast. As the ship sails across the ocean, it's burning the fuel out. And that fuel is down at the lowest part of the ship. So as it is removed, as it's burned away, the ship becomes a little more top heavy and a little more top heavy and a little more top heavy and a little more top heavy. And of course, stability is a critical function for a ship at sea. Also, as the fuel burns off, it creates what's called a free surface effect. The tank is neither full nor empty. There's a surface in there, and as the ship rolls, that sloshes, and that actually will decrease your stability. So typically what you would do back in the day is you would start to fill that tank with seawater, which would float at the top, keep the free surface away, and as you burn the fuel off, the tank would be filled with water. And then when you wanted to refill it with oil, what do you do with the water? Pump it over the side in port, because there's no rules against that back in the 1960s, right? So, but that took time, right? And that water exchange, the ballasting, the bunkering of the ship in port took time. And time in port is time you're not at sea. And when you're at sea, you're delivering cargo and you're earning revenue for delivering the cargo. So when you have a nuclear merchant ship whose cargo is a core of uranium that's, you know, however small it is, and it doesn't change in weight or distribution, because, you know, the fission reaction, the fuel is still there. It's just transformed into different elements. And so your stability suddenly is the same from the time you leave port to get to the next port. And you don't have to worry about compensating for ballast, and you don't have to spend time bunkering the ship. And you don't have to spend time cleaning the tanks in order to bunker the ship. And all of that translates into the possibility that the nuclear merchant ship will make more round trips per year than the conventional equivalent, and will thus earn more money on the same capital cost. So there were a lot of ideas, and this is very similar to why nuclear propulsion was attractive for naval vessels. And so there was a tremendous interest in applying nuclear technology to commercial shipping for those reasons, because it provided operational advantages that held the promise of earning more revenue. Nobody knew about decommissioning. Decommissioning is a huge percentage of the original cost of construction. It's going to be 30 or 40% of the original cost of construction of the nuclear power plant to decommission that plant, because it's controlled demolition, controlled dismantlement, not demolition. And consequently, not knowing those economics back in the 60s, Marriott didn't know it either. You know, the Atomic Energy Commission really didn't appreciate it then. That economic factor dooms future nuclear merchant ships more than likely. There's a lot of interest in future nuclear propulsion, but somebody's going to have to figure out the solution to that problem first. So, you know, I'm from New York. I talk a lot. I tend to talk fast if I can, but I sense perhaps we're at the end, so thank you very much. I've got time to take anything offline if we want to.
Let's give Earhart another round of applause. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention about some of the things that are in the exhibit. Some of them are donations that Earhart provided us from Marriott, some of the china and the glassware and silver service, which is all features that atomic symbol, which is really cool. And I'm going to like to think that maybe the Star Trek got the name Enterprise from this now. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I'm going to believe. There's also a flag that flew on the nuclear ship Savannah in 2012 that then Earhart brought down to us as part of that anniversary. So I encourage you to take a look at those materials before you head out. Also, there are some things on that table that you can take if you would like, both from the City Archives and from Earhart and Marriott. Just a heads up about our October programming. October is Archives Month, and we usually try to do something a little bit different for Archives Month. We recently, Archive staff did a really fun like Savannah games based on history trivia, so we're going to offer that for, that was from some employees. We're going to offer that as our October program. So if you like game shows and classic game shows, and you like Savannah history and trivia, please look out for that announcement. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you very much.
Thank you.